right, everybody, we are working on getting this out to our pages. We are in Exodus 17. If you'd like to go ahead and get your Bible turned there, we'll have it on the screen in just a second. But we appreciate everybody joining us tonight. Like I say, we'll be looking at Exodus 17 in just a minute. All right, I think we've got everything situated now. Appreciate everyone bearing with us for just a second while we get that done. As I said, we're in Exodus 17. We are looking again tonight at Moses and the Israelites preparing to get in the wilderness or go in the wilderness. They are in the wilderness, matter of fact, headed toward Mount Sinai. They've not reached the area yet, but we're going to see that they are on their way and they are headed that way. Matter of fact, we're going to see not that chapter 17 is actually one of the shorter, or the shorter chapter what we've been talking about. So it shouldn't be too hard to go through and look at this and get through it tonight. All right, let's go ahead and let's get to our passage. All right, as I said, we're in Exodus 17. We're continuing looking. Remember last week we looked at chapter 16 where they had just crossed the Red Sea. They had complained at Marah about the bitter water. Remember, God told Moses what he needed to do to get the water to work and the water to come. Make the water sweet, where he had to cut the limb and throw it in and it would become sweet water and they would be able to drink it. We get to chapter 17, and chapter 17 begins in a very similar situation. Remember, after the water, last week we also talked about the manna and the quail, of them complaining about food, and so God had to send them food. And this again was a sign to prove who God was, that God was really who he claimed to be, and God was with them. Chapter 17 is another very interesting chapter. In chapter 17, the people are going to go into another region, and again they grumble and complain. This is about the fourth or fifth time we've seen Israel grumble. I believe this is the fourth time we've seen them grumble after leaving Sinai, and the fifth time overall. The first time was when they were in Egypt and Moses spoke to Pharaoh, remember? And Pharaoh told Moses he wasn't going to listen to him, but instead he was going to make the work on the people that much harder. And he did that. Then later, about chapter 14, the people complained about the being at the Red Sea. Remember, they led them to the Red Sea. They were surrounded by wilderness and Pharaoh's behind them. And they asked Moses, did you bring us out here to die? Because we didn't have anything or there weren't enough graves in Egypt. And that was their second complaint. The third complaint, as I mentioned a minute ago, was at the place that would be called Marah, where they had the bitter water, and they complained to Moses because they couldn't drink the water, and so God had to do something to make the water where they could drink it. The third time was what we talked about last week, was when they complained about not having food. How dare Moses bring them out here with no food, and he just brought them out here to suffer and to die of starvation. Then now we have the fourth time since the Exodus, the fifth time overall, Israel comes and complains about not having water. And this sort of sets up an event that happens later in the book of Numbers. I believe it's Numbers 20 or Numbers 30. Probably the more famous of these encounters happens where Moses's faith, if you will, is tested. Where Moses we see what happens with Moses when he's called to do this similar miracle. But here Moses is called to do something by God to help the people, and Moses obeys it to God's fullest. Then later, when we get to Numbers, in Numbers, we'll see Moses doesn't obey God, and it costs Moses dearly. But that's for another lesson, another time. But for tonight, let's start in verse 1 of chapter 17 of Exodus, and let's begin looking at what he says. It says, all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? Now, before we go on, let's notice some things here. Number one, they've left the wilderness of Sin and entered into this area of Rephidim. Rephidim, again, is an area we're not sure about where exactly this is, but it's somewhere between the Egyptian border and Sinai. They've not reached Sinai yet. They're headed towards Sinai. They're probably in a mountain region near Sinai, but they're not there yet. And we also get a hint of how Israel moves. You know, he talks about they left by stages. Later, we're going to see that when God gives them the tabernacle at the end of this chapter, he's going to lay out which tribe goes first, which tribe goes second and third, and he's going to lay out a pattern for how they're supposed to move. And there's an idea that possibly they were already going through this pattern. They were already moving in these stages, and that again, you've got 2 million people moving. When the first people get to moving and the time you get to the back, there's a lot of time has elapsed there. So this is a huge crowd. And so they get to this place called Rephidim. Again, we don't know where it is, but most people think that what this is an oasis. It looks like an oasis. It is a place that appears to have whales, and this is common in this area. It appeared to have whales. It has trees. It's a place where people would stop to drink and get refreshment, to rest from their travels as they travel. But they get there, and this one doesn't have any water. And some people have said the way this is worded, that there was no water for the people to drink, gives an indication that possibly there were whales at this place, at this Rephidim, but the wells were dry. And during the dry season, that can happen, and that can easily occur. So the people come here expecting, and here's the thing, the people come expecting to find water, expecting to find what they need, their necessities, and they get here and there's nothing there. There is nothing. And so the people, therefore, notice verse 2, people getting to quarrel with Moses, they're getting to fight with Moses. And they demand of Moses, give us water to drink. And again, I wonder how much this has been that God has stepped up. God has answered all their previous requests. I'm wondering if this is this demand. They're saying, give us water. Not what are we going to do, Moses, but give us water. You've already changed the water from bitter to sweet. You got God deliver manna from heaven. Find a way to get him to give us water. They're very selfish about this. And you notice Moses' response, and Moses acknowledges this. He says, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you fight with me? Why do you test the Lord? Moses is basically asking, why are you having these fits? Why are you having these issues? Don't you know what God has done before, what he will continue to do? And that's sort of the idea. Moses is worried and telling the people, not really worried, but he's worried about how God's going to respond by telling the people, God has taken care of you so far. He's went above and beyond anything you need. What makes you think this is going to be any different? But then you notice verse 3 again. The people thirsted for water. They're thirsty. They are dehydrated. They are ready for some kind of nourishment, and they grumble. They grumble, and that's one of the key things they say. They grumble against Moses. And again, this is all those the 4 times they've grumbled since they left Egypt. In every one of those cases, they said about the same thing, and that is, Moses, why did you bring us out here to die? You just brought us out here because there wasn't enough graves in Egypt. And again, they say, why did you bring us up out of Egypt? Why did you make us leave? Remember last week, talking about we left that place that had meat pots and food and water. Why did we leave that place that had everything we wanted? Now they forgot they were slaves. They forgot the labor they were under. They forgot all those hard times. They just remembered the good times. They just remembered what they had there. And again, we sometimes, and I say this because we sometimes do the same thing, don't we? We sometimes forget how blessed we are when things turn against us. When we lose something, we complain about it. We've getting lucky here. I remember where we lived at in Alabama. We lived a little bit away from town, and the area we were in was notorious for the power going out. We lived out in the woods, and it was all the time trees would fall and knock down a power line, and you'd be without power. When you were without something you were expecting, you thought you needed, you could grumble and complain. There were many times we would grumble and complain about it. And we'd forget about it, though, when the power come back on. We'd forget about the blessing we had before. And that's sort of what these people do. They've forgotten what God had done before. They've forgotten that God would take care of them because they're just focused on the here and now. And this is a lesson for us to not focus on the here and now, but focus on the long range. Focus on what God has done in the past, what he will continue to do. Now, the other thing about this is they come out and they bring up the Moses problem to kill them, but not just to kill them this time. Notice it's very interesting in that they said that he's not just come to kill us, but also our children and our livestock. They've expanded that list of people Moses is going to kill. That they're basically saying, now, Moses, you've just brought us out here for all of us to be put to death. All of us are going to die. Why did you do this to us? Why did you bring us out here? And so this is what the people are complaining about. This is what Moses is dealing about. Then verse 4. So Moses cried to the Lord, what shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said to Moses, pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Now, here's what God does. All right, well, let's get Moses first. Moses comes to God. This is one good thing about Moses. When Moses has an issue, Moses has learned to go to God. Go to God, and God will tell you what to do. He goes to God and says, what shall I do? Well, God, what am I going to do with this? They're grumbling. They're complaining again. And notice how severe their grumbling and complaining is, in that Moses says they are ready to stone me. This is the first time that Israel's been so upset, been so furious with their leader that they want to kill him. Moses is afraid. He says, they're going to kill me, and then they're going to go back to Egypt. He says, God, what am I going to do? And again, notice he says, what shall I do? Not what shall we do? What shall I do for this people? And I say that to emphasize this. I think Moses is trying to tell God something God already knew, was that there was nothing Moses could do. Moses is asking God, what can I do for this? Knowing that he couldn't do anything, and therefore he would have to depend on God to do something. And so God comes to Moses and says, okay, here's what you're going to do. He says, I want you to go before the people. And the idea here that Moses is going to march in front of the people. He's going to walk by the people to out. And some people think that he may have walked a good distance to get to the rock he's about to go to. But Moses, he tells Moses, you walk before the people. You take some elders with you. Take your staff in your hand and go. Now, what God is doing here, it's not told here, but God wants Israel to see Moses leaving. God wants Israel to see Moses leave with his staff. This is a formal procession. This is like a parade, if you will. This is Moses walking through the people, by the people, and the people are going to see him, and they're going to see the elders. Now, these elders are coming for a very specific reason. These elders are going to be witnesses. They're going to be witnesses to what God's about to do, so that when anybody asks a question or anybody wonders about what happens here in the wilderness, they will know it wasn't Moses who did this. It was God. And so God tells Moses, you go and you take that staff in your hand. You take that staff, the same staff they struck the Nile with, same staff that turned to the snake, the staff that they're going to keep forever until they put it in the ark, or until Aaron and Moses die, they're going to put it in the ark. That stick, that staff is the symbol of God, a symbol of God's power. We're going to see that stick play two very important roles tonight, or that staff is going to play two important roles tonight as we look at the story of Moses and the Israelites. And so God tells them to go. And then you notice the next verse 6. God continues speaking here, says, behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And then he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? So God says, you go, you're going to march by all these people. You're going to go toward this Mount Horeb, or this range of Horeb. And that's the idea, because Horeb is associated with Sinai. They're not at Sinai yet, but people think that Horeb is a range of mountains. It's a range that stretches out a while. So they're at the beginning probably of Horeb. And God says, you're going to go and you're going to go to this rock. You're going to go to this rock and you're going to strike this rock. And when you strike this rock, you're going to strike this rock and you're going to strike this rock and you are going to speak to this rock. Give me just a second. I gotta check something. All right, sorry about that. So they're going to strike the rock. And he's going to strike the rock, and he's going to show the people that the elders are going to be a witness that this is what Moses has done. Where we need to be. And so Moses does this. And then you notice verse 7, Moses calls the name of that place Massah. And that is the idea to quarrel. And Meribah is to test God. And so God goes Moses, and this has always been one of the interesting miracles to me that God does with Moses, is I wonder what that must have been like to see water come from a rock. The closest I've ever come to this idea, and I could sort of imagine this, it's sort of interesting, is over in Alabama, at Natural Bridge. They've got one of those natural springs. If you go to Natural Bridge Park, you go back there in one of those springs, and you have to walk a pretty good trail to get back there, but they got a pipe coming out of a rock, and that pipe has water running out of it. It's an artesian well back there. And whenever I think about this water coming from the rock, I always picture that artesian well, because you just got a piece of pipe hammered into a rock, and there's water constantly flowing through that. And that's sort of the side here that Moses goes to this rock. He hits the rock with his staff, and water begins to come out. And again, the other thing about this, I think about that picture I told you, Mingo, that artesian well, but that's just a little bitty pipe with a little bit of water in it. But this water was enough to give water to 2 million people. This had to be a sight to behold. And Moses does exactly what God told him to do. Now, one other thing about this in verse 6, where God says, I will stand before you. Some people think that there's some way, well, we know there's some way that God shows his presence here. There's going to be no question. This is from God, not Moses. And some people think that what happens here is the cloud that God's been using to lead the people, that the cloud has ascended upon the rock that Moses is going to strike. And so you notice Moses did what God told him to do. This is very interesting. In last chapter, God told Moses he's going to test Israel to see if they'll listen to him. Here you have Moses as the only recorded Israelites who listened to God, who obeyed God and did exactly what God told him to do. And then he named a place Massah and Meribah. Again, Massah being to quarrel, and Meribah being to test. And then you notice he said they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? Now, whether or not they exactly said those exact words, but that was the gist of the question. That was the gist of their complaining, the grumbling. Well, is God here or is God not? Is God going to save us, or is God going to let us perish? What is God going to do? And so Moses and the people are here at Rephidim, and they have come, and now God has provided them water. And he's provided it in such a way that there's no doubt that this water has come from God and him alone. Then we get into verse 8. We'll go back to that slide I just showed you a minute. I want to read verse 8, then we'll go back to what I just showed you. Verse 8, then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Now, Amalek comes, and Amalek has come with the Amalekites, and they're going to fight Israel. Now, this is the first time Israel's going to have to go to war. Now, Exodus doesn't really tell us much about this fighting. Why Amalek came down, what Amalek was trying to do, just that they fought them. Well, we go forward to Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 17 through 19, when God is getting ready to tell Israel going to Canaan, he says these words, and he says the words of what Amalek did back in Exodus 17. And in Deuteronomy 25, beginning verse 17, he says this, remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you, and the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek. From under heaven you shall not forget. So God says here, he gives a prophecy here about what he's going to do, and that he's going to wipe out the Amalekites. Now, what happens here is verse 17 and 18 reveal to us what Amalek did, what Amalek and Amalekites did. And that is that he attacked the rear guard of Israel. Not really the rear guard. He attacked the rear section, the weak, those who are fainting, those who are struggling to walk the path. That's what Amalekite attacked. And the Amalekites here, they didn't attack because Israel was in their land. As a matter of fact, it's not until they go to where the 12 tribes are, when the 12 spies go into the land of Canaan and spy for 40 days, and they come back out and people say no. The people then say they're going to fight for God after God tells them, okay, you said no, you're going to wander for 40 years. They say, no, we'll go fight for land. They go after the Amalekites. They attack Amalekites at their land. And the thing is, that land is a pretty good piece north of where they are. Amalekites, here the Amalekites are not fighting to defend. I say that Amalekites are not fighting to defend their land. The Amalekites have come after Israel to plunder them. They've heard the stories. They've got this a group of slaves that's wandering in the wilderness, and they're going to try to take their possessions. They're going to try to test them out. And this is what God said. They attacked you on the way when you're faint and weary. They cut off your tail. They attacked that rear section, cut off the people. They stopped those people from. And again, notice they did not fear God. They haven't learned the lesson of the Egyptians. They didn't learn the rest of the Canaan. You know, Canaanites had learned that what God had done to Egypt. That story hadn't circulated or they didn't believe it yet. And so God tells them to remember what they did to you. And in remembering that, in verse 19, God tells them he's going to blot their memory out. He's going to remove them. And that's going to be what happens with Saul, or supposed to happen to Saul. Saul is told to go after, when he becomes king, so to go after the Amalekites. And when he goes, he's supposed to kill the king, and he's supposed to end that race. Well, if you remember that story, Saul wipes out the city of Amalekite, but he doesn't kill the king. He doesn't do a complete destruction as God told him to. And that's the final straw that breaks Saul losing the kingdom. Is Saul's unwillingness to follow God's command to wipe them out. But that's in the Kings. For now, just notice the Amalekites attacked Israel while they're at a weakened state. There's no fighting because they're trying to invade their land or coming closer to them. They're simply fighting to try to plunder them. And so God tells them, I was with you then, I'll be with you now. So let's go back to Exodus 17. Let's see what happens. Exodus 17, verse 9. So Moses said to Joshua, choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Now, what's interesting about these verses here is we're introduced to two characters that we have not been introduced to before now. And one of them is very odd the way this is introduced. And that's verse 9, where Moses said to Joshua, well, if you could find somebody who don't know the story of Israel, and you have them read this, and they get to verse 9, they'll see this named Joshua and say, well, who is Joshua? We've not encountered Joshua so far. We've not heard anything about Joshua. We don't know his business. Now later we find out that this is Moses's second in command. This is Moses's guy who he chooses to lead the army. This is one Moses is trained to be the next leader. This is the man who's going to take Moses' place. But we're not told any of that here, other than Moses says he told Joshua. And I say all that, say this, is that Moses, I believe here, is expecting us to already know what happens in the future, to know the name Joshua, so he doesn't have to introduce Joshua here. But he tells Joshua, you go find some men, choose some men from us, and go fight with Amalek. And Moses says, tomorrow I'll stand on top of the hill. He'll stand on the hill overlooking the battle, and he'll have the staff of God in his hand. And he says, I'll stand on that hill, and I'll be your encouragement, if you will. I'll be your sign of what you're going to do. I don't know if Moses knows what's going to happen next. He may have, but I don't really know if he knew what God was going to do with him. And then you notice verse 10, again, we get a sign of Joshua's character, in that just as Moses did what God said, Joshua did as Moses said. He listens to him, and he goes and he fights Amalek. And as he's fighting, Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up on top of the hill. Now, this is a little odd to us because we fight war differently than they did. For centuries, this was how they fought war. And not the way we fight. You know, when we go to war, you have to, our soldiers now, if they go overseas, they have to be careful and go step by step and check every house and check rooms, make sure nobody's behind the door. We do what we call guerrilla warfare. In the ancient world, you didn't do that. In the ancient world, again, up till the last couple hundred years, you did war by lining up your men. You had your men in lines, and they would meet on this big open field. We saw this battle all the way up, this style of fighting all the way up to the American Revolution. Even the Civil War was that way. And people, they would find these valleys, these fields to go to war in, and people would sit up on the hills, on the ridge, and they would watch it. They'd watch us fight. And that's sort of what we get here, but we get our second character we've not been introduced to for it. We've seen Moses, we know Aaron, we don't know Hur. Hur is a question mark of who exactly he is. He pops up a few places here and there, nothing like Joshua, but he pops up a couple places. And Josephus, an ancient Jewish historian from the time of Jesus, he writes, and again, this is his saying, and again, he may not be 100% right, or he may not just been guessing, but he writes and says that Hur, and this sort of makes sense, is Miriam's husband. They say this is Moses and Aaron's son-in-law or brother-in-law, which would make sense because, again, we see Moses, we see Aaron, and we see Miriam taking a very key part in leadership. And if Miriam been married, then there's a good possibility that her husband would have been a key part as well. So Moses, Aaron, and her are up on the hill watching this battle. Now, verse 11. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary. So they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun, and Joshua overwhelmed Amalekite and his people with the sword. So this is a very interesting battle, is that God tells us this battle, and again, this gives some insight that even though they were fighting a battle, God was still there. God was still involved. And it has always been one of those very interesting stories in that Moses begins by holding his hand up. The idea is he holds that staff that he's brought to the hill. And as whenever he holds this staff up, Israel wins. Israel is prevailing. They are defeating their enemy. But then when Moses gets weary and he starts to lower this staff down, Amalek begins to win. And this has always been one of those very interesting pictures I've tried to picture in my mind of seeing how this must have been for Moses and wondering how it's been. Again, remember, Moses is 80 years old. Yes, he's a lot different than our people are. He's a very sturdy man. But to sit there and hold your arms up the entire day was no easy feat. And so Moses is out here stretching out his hands. And eventually he gets where, again, he lowers them. They begin to lose. He probably picks them back up. But eventually he begins to wear out. He begins to get weary. And so what Moses or what Aaron and Hur do is they go get a big rock. They get a big stone and they put it underneath Moses so he can see it. And they set him down. Then when they set him down, Aaron and Hur get on each side of him and they hold his hands up. They make sure his hands don't droop. They make sure the staff doesn't drop. And they do this again. They make sure his hands were steady the entire day till the sun went down. And then till the going down of the sun. And that's when Joshua and his people overwhelmed the Amalekites and overwhelmed Amalek and his people. And they defeated them. Again, this is a very interesting idea for, again, a couple reasons. One is God's presence in the battle, that God would give them victory if Moses held the staff up. And it's sort of a sign to Joshua and to the army that God is with them, that God is fighting for them. The other thing that's interesting is this has to be an embarrassing loss for Amalek. And I think this may be God trying to prove a point, because here you got this bunch of slaves who are out in the wilderness wandering around, and apparently they look lost, so they don't know where they're going. They ain't even got to the wandering phase yet. And they're going out, and this king sees them, and this king says, hey, let's go attack them. We can take their possessions. We can defeat them easily. And he goes to war with them, and he gets slaughtered. Him and his army get defeated. They fought all day long. And again, the other thing that's different to our mindset is the other thing about war you've got to realize is their wars were different than our wars. Their wars had breaks. At the end of the day, when it became right at dark, they would stop. No matter where you were at, you would stop. You stop your fighting. You would go your way. You would go to your side, and they would go to their side. And some places they actually stopped a little bit before dark. And what they would do is before dark, the surviving soldiers would go out into the field and they would drag all the injured and dead soldiers back to their side to either bury them or to take care of them. And then at night they would go to sleep. If the battle wasn't decided that day, they would rest that night and get up next morning and do it again. Very different style of war. So this is what it means here, that they fought till the sun went down, that it was the very end of the day, but Joshua and his people prevailed. They defeated them in battle. Again, battles could last for days or weeks, but not this one. And so Joshua, and then we see again this slave group They had no training of war, no training of fighting, but yet they were able to defeat Amalek and his army. Amalek and his men. Again, we don't know how big his army was, but it was big enough that Joshua could take some men and adequately deal with it. And again, this says a lot that God was with them. These slaves who, again, they would never come close to a sword. Most of them wouldn't have come close to a sword. Most of them wouldn't have been trained sword because Egypt surely didn't want to train their slaves to fight because they trained their slaves to fight and they may rebel against them. But this slave army was able to defeat this king's army. And so here you have in this chapter, God taking care of his people. Then notice the last one in verse 14, the last few verses where he says, and the Lord said to Moses, write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I may utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, the Lord is my banner, saying, a hand upon the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Again, some interesting things happen. Number one, God tells Moses to write this down in a book. This is the first time we see reference to Moses recording things in a book. God says, write down this as a memorial to remember what happened. And then the second thing about this is recite it in the ears of Joshua. Tell Joshua what I'm telling you. Tell Joshua what's happening. That way Joshua can know that, again, not that Joshua would take credit, but Joshua can know that it wasn't he who won the war, but it was God. And then after he does that, in verse 15, Moses builds an altar. He builds a heap of stones. What they would do is they'd take 12 stones, one for each tribe, and they would use it to build an altar, a memorial of what has happened. And Moses said, he called the place, the Lord is my banner. The Lord is my ensign. The Lord is my sign. And this, some people think this word, the Lord is my banner, is a reference to what Moses had done. The word ensign can be also flag or banner. Is that Moses holding that stick up and holding his staff in the air was a sign from God, a wave, a flag of God, that this was God's victory. And then again, he built this altar and he said, may this altar remind the people here that the Lord will fight with Amalek from generation to generation. The God will fight with Amalek from here to the end of time, or until the end of these people, until what God wipes them out, what he said in Deuteronomy 25. So Moses again emphasizes that God's going to blot out Amalek. And that's also mentioned in verse 14, where God tells Moses, tell Joshua, I'm going to blot them out. I will remove them from all history. And that's eventually what God does. So that is the end of chapter 17. Like I say, chapter 17 is a chapter of, again, God providing for Israel. God has provided for Israel every time they turn around. However, when they cry out to God, they cry out for God to bless them, God to take care of them, God to feed them, God to give them water, God to get them out of the situation. They always question, is God going to hear? Is God really here? Is God really going to do this for us? And God fulfills his role every time. It's very interesting, the patience God has with these people. And it tells a lot of things about it, too, that God, the patience of God. We sometimes think of God, our God in the New Testament as being a different God than the Old. Of God, we have a God of mercy. We have a God of grace. Well, these stories in Exodus show us very clearly that in the Old Testament it was the same God. It was the same God. It was the same ruler, the same one who had mercy and had grace. If anybody is an example of God's mercy and grace, it's the Israelites. That within just a couple months, and again, the exact timing we really don't know, but this was within a couple months at most, Moses and the people of Israel, have grumbled 4 times since leaving Israel. And God hadn't said, yet I'm done with you. I'm done with you. Now, he is going to say that later, but as a test to Moses, we'll talk about that when we get to Exodus 30 or Exodus 33 or 34, I believe. But God was gracious, and God continually provided for the people, continually looked after them as long as they would, as long as they'd be his people. He called them to be his people. And again, not all of them were his people. Not all of them were faithful, but the ones who were, he continued to help them. And again, that's the great lesson for us. The great lesson for us is that as God blessed those people, as God took care of those people, he provided those people and provided for them based on his promises, He'll continue to provide for us. He'll continue to look after us. As long as we are his faithful people, and as long as we are those who follow him, we'll have the same promise, the same reward of a great heavenly home if we'll stay true and live for him. And we know that he is a God who will provide all things for us. I appreciate you joining us here tonight. Appreciate you join again. Remember, Sunday morning we meet for our worship at 10 a.m. Also, remember we do our live stream here on Facebook and YouTube. So if you get a chance to join us there, we'd love to have you. But for tonight, we're going to stop right here. Next week, as we said, we'll pick up in Exodus 18. But for tonight, we appreciate everybody being here. Appreciate you tuning in and watching us. And we hope that you're having a good week, a God bless week. And we hope to see you all real soon.